session for the day. Our first speaker is Professor Dr. Eligar Sadeh, the man who wrote the book. Professor Eligar is CEO and founder of both Astropolitics Institute and Astro Consulting International LLC, chief editor of the academic Journal of Astropolitics, and a professor of astrophysics, aerospace engineering, and astropolitics. Professional experiences include work with NASA, Lockheed Martin Space Systems, Stanford University, University of Colorado, U.S. Air Force Academy Eisenhower, Center of Space and Defense Studies, and the International Space University. Professor Eligar's leadership at the Institute and seminal books, Space Strategy in the 21st Century, The Politics of Space, A Survey, and Space Politics and Policy, an Evolutionary Perspective, helped revolutionize the way we think about the human relationship to space enterprise.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers at the university. I was in India back in 2016, so I have a lot of colleagues I work with there and have close friendships. I appreciate the invite. I'm on the other side of the world, so for me it's very, very late at night. So it's right now it's past midnight. I'm in Colorado in the United States. So in many ways, actually, Colorado is like Bangalore in India. It's at the center of the aerospace industry in the United States. It's second or third in terms of how you rate it in terms of space economy. So I'm right at the center of many, many activities right here in Colorado, where I live, in the Boulder, Denver area. Yeah, so I just wanted to make a few brief comments. And I'm looking forward to the session and then to questions later on. Did want to highlight the journal that many of you are aware of, the Journal of Astropolitics, that I've been editing for the past 18 years. Great journal to look at, to update you on issues related to everything dealing with space and what I kind of call the soft side of space, the human relationship to the space enterprise, everything from the strategy, the policy, the law, the economics, the managerial activities, the ethical dimensions, cultural dimensions of our space enterprise. So I've really kind of broadly defined it as the human relationship to the space enterprise. And that's in essence what Astropolitics is all about and what the journal is all about as well. Today, I just wanted to make a few brief remarks in my time here of about 15 minutes on the privatization of space activities. With that, I just wanted to lay out a few definitions that I think could be helpful here. Very often we tend to use the words privatization and commercialization interchangeably. And I think it's worthwhile to kind of define these terms to draw some distinctions here. Commercialization has always been with us. There was some good introductory remarks in the last session that I heard from Sandeep Bhatt and other colleagues on the outer space law regime. And in regard to that, how the states are ultimately responsible for their actors, right? Including their commercial actors, private actors, and the states are responsible for that. And that is true. But I think it's important to point out that although we have a new advent of space today in regard to the privatization of space activities, commercial space has always been with us since the rise of the space age. It's nothing new on the commercial end. In fact, if you look at, I'll just draw on the US example because I'm most familiar with that, living here in the United States. During the Apollo era, 80% of everything NASA did was under contract to the commercial aerospace industry. The United States in the early 1960s seeded what later on became privatized, the development of commercial satellites for telecommunications purposes. particularly in the geosynchronous orbital domain. And that was seeded in the 1960s already. So commercial activity has always been with us, and commercial activity is simply the government contracting to develop hardware, to develop technology from commercial players, right? From the commercial aerospace industry. The government in that relationship, which is a traditional relationship, the government plays a role in terms of basically making sure the profit is there. And the commercial industry area relies on the government for their revenue, for their profit generation. And there really is no business model in a private sense that has developed. Now, what's occurred over the last several decades, beginning with the telecommunications industry in relationship to the satellite part of that for telecommunication services, global telecommunication services. And then today, which we're seeing in the space launch sector, in transport to low Earth orbit for humans and cargo, as in the example of SpaceX and other players in that market space as well, we're seeing a privatization of activities. Where now the government is still involved in terms of being an actor, but the government now becomes a customer of those services. The government will play a role maybe in seeding the funding, supporting the funding, sharing expertise, incentivizing the industry. But the government now becomes a customer where the commercial actor, which is now privatized activities, has more at risk, right? They have more, their activity is really at risk, just like in a more traditional business private market sense. So I think that's important to kind of draw out those distinctions. A few other facts that I think are worthwhile, and then I want to look at some trends. We can get to the second slide here, but not quite yet, is that in the area of both commercial space, as I've defined it, and in the area of privatization of space activities, there still is a government dependence. Okay, in the case of commercial space, the dependence is you're a government contractor. A great example of that is United Launch Alliance in the United States was set up by Boeing and Lockheed Martin to support military space launch. And they really don't need to have much of a business model outside of providing a reliable launch service to support military space security missions for the US government. That's a traditional commercial model based on government contracting of those services. So, and there is a dependence there, right? But the interesting development, though, is even on the privatization side, even though there is this privatization surge that we're seeing today, that really kind of began in the telecommunications era, that really occurred with telecommunication satellites back in the early 1990s. And it's accelerated today, as I mentioned, with space transportation services and other services that people are thinking of. There still is a government dependence in that area as well. So in other words, commercial space or private space, the privatization of space activities would not exist without either the government contracting for those services to make sure the industry is sustainable and profitable, or with the government as the key, what I would call anchor actor, anchor support for these private services. So that's, I think, important to point out. There's not enough of a commercial or private market as of yet to support many of the space activities. The one exception is in telecommunication satellites. There is an exception there, but when we're talking about space transportation services, there really is not that kind of market. And the same is true with remote sensing, the other key area where we have commercial and private space activities. It's also important to point out that most of what's occurred on the commercial or private end, or most of what's occurred initially on the private end, was in terms of space for Earth, meaning that we engage in space activities with benefits back to Earth. such as telecommunication services that I've been mentioning across the board, and that includes direct television broadcasting, that includes internet services and other global communication services that do exist. We do have this emergent market of space to space, where we're doing activities in space. Future markets may include even manufacturing or made in space activities that have yet to be realized. So with that, I just kind of wanted to set the tone for that. I did highlight here some of the privatization of space activities, some of the trends that I am observing, with impacts for obviously policy and law. So I think one fundamental trend and impact is that we're seeing the agenda and even the implementation of certain space activities, particularly in the area of space launch for both cargo and crew, shifting to the privatization of space activities. And what I mean by this is that private space actors in many ways are now setting the agenda. In 20 years of SpaceX existence, they now control the majority of the space launch market commercially, and they've privatized that activity. And the shift is, instead of contracting for the development by industry, as I mentioned earlier, we've moved to a model where the government now looks to the commercial or private sector to provide services under fixed price arrangements. That means those private and commercial actors have much more at risk, right? They have much more capital at risk, much more know-how and expertise and technology at risk, but they own the intellectual property. They are now providing a service to government under a commercial arrangement. So I think that's important to point out, and I was kind of mentioning that earlier, but I think there's a larger issue going on here, in that if you're looking at the agenda for both space launch and even the agenda for the trajectory of human spaceflight, we're seeing a very, very interesting development where now, for the first time in history, you have the private sector, I would argue, is in part driving the agenda. And I think you're seeing this in terms of particularly thinking about humanity as a spacefaring species and thinking about the ambitions of SpaceX, using that as a great example on their drive towards humans to Mars within this decade or towards the early part of the 2030s. So I think that's important. So in certain civil space pursuits, I think you're seeing that fundamental shift where the government is no longer driving the agenda. And I think you're seeing as well a great advancement and impact on policy and law and governance, which is my next point here, where you have an advancement in regulatory law in the United States as a result of the emergence of the privatization of space activities. So now you have the government as the responsible party, right, authorizing their actors to engage in space activities, is now evolving their own regulatory regimes in very, very specific ways, but working hand in hand with the private actors, right? So the private actors' interests are met at the same time that the state responsibilities are met in regard to the outer space treaty regime that was well discussed in the previous session. So I think you're seeing a certain advancement in certain areas, and this also carries over in the area of what I would call space governance. As a result, in the evolution of the regulatory regime, you are now committing private space actors to engage more responsibly, more sustainably. You're committing them to certain universally accepted practices and understandings coming from the outer space treaty regime, kind of speaking about it as an entire legal regime that both manifests itself internationally, but then also manifests itself through domestic or national space law throughout the world in spacefaring countries. You're seeing commitments, for example, to the sustainable use of space, commitments to orbital debris mitigation, commitments to safety and feasibility. And obviously, one aspect that has been in there throughout is insurance, third-party liability, indemnification, and aspects of that as well, where you have this evolving regime that's much more advanced today as a result of the privatization of these space activities. So I think you've advanced in many ways the applicability of space law to the private sector, to private space activities, and you've advanced, I think, as well, from what I'm seeing, aspects of space governance and the sustainable uses of space. It's also in the industry's interest, right, to adopt best practices. We are seeing as well the emergence, for instance, of industry involvement separate from government for space situational awareness, particularly in regard to the orbital debris issue, space conjunction issues that can occur between debris and existing satellites, or even conjunction issues that can occur between functional satellites themselves. So kind of deconflicting that and allowing for governance to emerge, I think is one big impact here that needs to be highlighted. The last one that I wanted to highlight here, as my time is running short, has to do with what I would call entrepreneurship and business development. I think we're seeing a very exciting prospect here in that in the privatization of space activities, I think you're seeing great leaps and innovations in technology that hasn't occurred before. The example, I think we've seen this in the example of SpaceX without going into too much detail, core booster return, advancement in spacecraft design, spacesuit design, advancements in the way space operations are conducted, and doing it on a basis of privatizing all those activities. Embodied therein as well, I think, is a very strong risk-taking culture and ethos that we only saw early on in the space age with government run space activities, whether through contracting with the commercial sector or through government developed capability in-house. We saw this early on, kind of this risk-taking culture and experimentation and innovation, particularly with the rise of the space age and into the 1960s, but that then began to wane as kind of the space race waned, the Apollo program ended. As we got to the mid-70s, late 70s, early 80s, a lot of that waned, and government-run space activities really kind of relied on existing capabilities, what we would call kind of heritage systems, and continue just to operate those with minor modifications in terms of efficiency and cost reductions. But there really was no strong risk-taking culture, and I think that's something that the privatization activities has brought forward, is this tremendous risk-taking that's led to, I think, breakthroughs in innovation, cost reductions. Many analysts have said, for instance, that SpaceX is going to realize a cost reduction factor as much as by tenfold in terms of per kilogram to launch to low Earth orbit or to lunar or Mars trajectories, possibly up to a tenfold reduction in cost as a result of the innovations taking place. And the other one to highlight is the way in which business is done. I mean, I think for the first time, what we've traditionally called the commercial aerospace industry is moving in a direction, or at least part of that industry, right? When we talk about companies like SpaceX and others, Blue Origins and others, I mean, there's several throughout the world to talk about, but I think SpaceX is the clear example and trendsetter here, is that they have to operate as a real business, right? They have to make a business case and a business model. And I think one of the problems that has always plagued entrepreneurship and business development in space has been the lack of a sound business model and a sound business case. And I think that's now changing in a very, very dramatic way, combined with, I think, innovations in organization and management that should be highlighted. We're seeing very, very unique approaches there. For instance, at SpaceX, which I know quite well because I've done some work with them. I've visited their facilities. I've talked with folks there. I know the president quite well of SpaceX. They're a very flat organizational structure. They've done their development in business in a very, very different way than the more hierarchical models that we see in the heritage or existing aerospace industry that emerged out of the Cold War and has continued to exist. You know, companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, for example, in the United States, which are the large-scale systems integrators. But we're seeing in SpaceX something very, very different in terms of their approaches to management and organization. It's very flat. You know, I've done a lot of detailed analysis of this and could go into more insight, you know, with questions later on. You know, finally, as my last point, you know, I think fundamentally as well, we're seeing the privatization of space activities, pushing forward an agenda, I think, of humanity as a spacefaring species. It's going to be an interesting decade to see how what SpaceX is doing and others are doing, like Blue Origins, and what's occurring in a space tourism in the suborbital domain, how this trend is going to manifest itself in other activities, from manufacturing in space to asteroid mining to even maybe the privatization of exploratory elements of space. You know, I think there are a lot of interesting dynamics that could begin to emerge here that I think are going to feed into this, you know, evolving journey we're on since the rise of the space age in 1958, of emerging and evolving Homo sapiens as a truly spacefaring species. So with that, I'll end here. And